So I'll explain the creation view of history, and we'll take all the questions you want. If you have a question, just go to the mic, and that would be easier for us. I have timelines here to indicate the two basic differences of opinion. The Bible teaches pretty clearly, if you add up the dates given in the book of Genesis and in Luke and several places, if you add up all the dates given, the Bible says the earth was created about 6,000 years ago. Not millions and billions. It was instantly created in 6 days. That's what I believe, a mature, fully functioning creation done in 6 days. And then the Bible says 4,400 years ago there was a flood when this world was destroyed. Noah built the ark and saved all the animals on board. The time before the flood was very different. People used to live to be 900 years of age. And most ancient cultures, like the Greek mythology and stuff, many of those ancient cultures talk about a time when people used to live to be nearly 1,000, called the Golden Age. I believe they're probably a messed up version of the literal biblical account of the time when people lived to be 900 plus years of age, before the flood. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I cover in my seminars when I've got 10 hours on why they used to live to be 900. After this flood came, and by the way, they've now been uncovered in anthropology, I guess is the best word for it, 250 different flood legends, different cultures that talk about a worldwide flood with a family saved in a boat. And they're all, you know, variations of, I think, the same theme of Noah's flood. I believe, as a Bible-believing Christian and a creationist, that the dinosaurs fit right into history. They were created in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. They were just big lizards. And Noah took dinosaurs onto the ark, probably babies. He'd be smart enough to figure that out. You don't have to bring the biggest ones you could find, you know, bring 2 small ones. Just be sure to get a pink one and a blue one. And then after the flood, I think 2 things happened to the dinosaurs. I think the climate killed off most of them because the climate was different. They couldn't live to be 900 anymore, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So they couldn't grow as big or get as old. The second thing happened to the dinosaurs was man's hunting. Back in those days, they called them dragons. They didn't have the word dinosaur till 1841. So they called them dragons, and they killed off most of the dragons back shortly after the flood, within the first 1,000 years or so. I have this chart to illustrate the difference between the 2 different meanings of the word evolution. And so you'll understand what I'm talking about when I say the word evolution. There is macroevolution and microevolution. I have a huge collection of science textbooks that are used in our public school system. I've noticed some of the newer ones, the 97 edition that I saw 2 days ago when I was up in Sylacauga, Alabama. The 97 edition textbooks have a section on micro and macro evolution. They're distinguishing between the two. I say, that's great. That's a start. Microevolution would be, actually a better word for that is just a variation. It's not really evolution in the sense of the word, but for instance, a dog can produce a variety of dogs. Probably the Great Dane and the Chihuahua came from a common ancestor, and it was a dog. But nobody has ever observed a dog produce a non-dog. Nor has anybody ever seen a dog come from a non-dog. So Darwin got all nervous and upset about the definition of the word species. I don't even argue about that. The species is kind of a nebulous term. They say if it's not interfertile, you know, it's not the same species. Well, I don't know if that's even a good breaking point, but probably dogs and wolves and coyotes and hyenas are all in the same kind. They're the same kind of animal. They're still in the dog. I hate to use the word family because that's part of Linnaeus's classification system, but we'll use the word family. They're the same kind of animal. They're a dog. And lots of variations are possible, from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane. But the variations have limits. You can try to crossbreed dogs and get bigger and bigger dogs, but I guarantee you will never get a dog as big as Pensacola. It won't happen. There are limits to the changes. And you will never get a dog as small as a flea. They do have a lot of variation, but that's not evolution at all. That's just a variation. It's still a dog. And the Bible says God made the animals to bring forth after their kind. And that's all we've ever observed. And if science deals with things that are observable, testable, demonstrable, all we've ever observed is variations. No real evolution. And it's that roses produce a variety of roses. Some estimates are that there are 800 varieties of roses right now. The original wild rose only had 5 petals. And through mutations and selective breeding and all this kind of stuff, they've developed roses with all sorts of petals. There's yellow ones and white ones and red ones, but they're still a rose. Most of the variations that have been produced by man over the last few thousand years would not survive in the wild. If you turned all the dogs in the world loose back into the woods, how long would the Chihuahuas last? He'd come up to a wolf, you know, yap, 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 crunch. He wouldn't last 5 minutes. So most of the variations that we see, like Chihuahuas and the Shar-Pei that's all wrinkled up, you know, they wouldn't last long in the wild at all. They've been produced by man through selective breeding for a very particular purpose, like to be a lap dog or the dachshund, you know, to chase the weasels down the hole or something like that. But the more wild you get in your variations, the less likely they are to survive in nature. You would probably, if you turned all the dogs loose into the world, after a few generations, end up with just 1 or 2 variants available, kind of like the Australian dingo or the wild dog is basically what they would end up melting back into that type of animal. That's the only one that would survive in nature. So microevolution is observable. We can see it happen. I don't argue with it at all. It is a fact that bacteria become resistant to drugs over time. That's not evolution. It started off a bacteria and it ends up a bacteria. That's still a bacteria. That doesn't prove that we all came from a rock. So variations, that they can be pointed out by the thousands. No question there are variations. There are variations in the human skull thickness and in the eyebrow thickness and in the placement of the skull on the neck, the occiput and atlas and the bones back there. And some people carry their head forward more and some carry it straight more. And there are variations in this room. We could line up the people in this room and show all sorts of variations, but they're still human. Microevolution is observable. It is scientific. It meets all the qualifications of being a science. It's observable, it's testable, it's demonstrable. And it is scriptural. This matches what the Bible says. The animals bring forth after their kind. That's all we've ever observed. Now, this does not prove that dogs and roses have a common ancestor. What happens, I'm afraid, in our school system, and I collect the public school textbooks and speak in public schools all the time, we are showing the students many, many examples of microevolution and then tricking them into making a giant leap of faith into believing that that is somehow evidence for macroevolution. And nothing could be further from the truth. Macroevolution is assumed. Nobody has ever observed any macroevolution. It can't be found in the fossil record, and it can't be found going on today. No examples whatsoever of anything changing to a fundamentally different kind. Macroevolution is unscriptural. I would say from this side of the chart over is science, from this side back is religion. So I will often use the phrase, evolution is a religion. It is not a science. And I'm referring to macroevolution. It is purely religious. You must believe that somehow everything came from nothing. You can believe that if you want, but don't call that science. That's never been observed. Nobody's ever observed nothing turn to something. The macroevolution philosophy must believe, with a capital B, it's their religion, they must believe that matter organizes itself. And yet all we've ever observed from science is that the second law of thermodynamics seems to be universal. Everything is falling apart. Nothing is getting more organized. Some people will give examples like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly as an example of evolution. Well, that's not evolution. That's all pre-coded in the DNA structure. That's just the butterfly following a very specific pattern, a very complex code that was already laid out. Or a baby growing into a full-grown human. They say that's an example of a reversal of the second law of thermodynamics. Oh, no, it's not. You follow all the laws of, you follow the second law of thermodynamics as you grow. You have to take in enormous amounts of food to get just a little bit of growth. Very inefficient. Average person to gain 150 pounds from birth would probably have to take in several tons of food. Very inefficient system as far as growth, and it's all based on the DNA code. It was coded in from birth. It's miraculous. It's an example of creation. So this word evolution really must be defined into the two different unrelated meanings, micro and macro. Oftentimes we're shown examples of some skeleton that they find, like Lucy, and this is supposed to be an example of evolution because Lucy had thicker femur bones, the thigh bone, and the bone was angled off, coming off the knee joint, a slight angle to it, indicating it was, learning to walk upright. Lucy, first place, I would point out that I don't believe this at all, but going from an ape to a human is a relatively minor change compared to going from a rock to a human. And ultimately, the evolutionist, at least the atheistic evolutionist, must believe that everything started off from a rock, and the rock came from nothing. I was at Westchester University in Pennsylvania several months ago. And one of the students was a senior anthropology student. He got upset because I said that evolutionists believe everything came from a rock. He said, "We don't believe we all came from a rock." I said, "You don't?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, let me ask you a question. Did I summarize the evolution position fairly? Do you believe there was a Big Bang 20 billion years ago?" He said, "Well, yes, 18 to 20. We don't know the age." And I said, "Do you believe the Earth cooled down and formed a hard rocky crust 4.6 billion years ago?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you believe the rocks got rained on and slowly turned into soup and the soup came alive 3 billion years ago?" He said, "Well, yes." I said, "So you believe we came from a rock?" He said, "No, I don't believe that at all." I said, "Let me run this by one more time." And I went through this is precisely what is taught in our textbooks, folks, and this is not science. What we do is we get little examples of little minor changes clear down here in the Cambrian era. And even if you look at the chart with all the so-called family trees, they all have dotted lines. If the honest ones have dotted lines connecting these different kinds down at the bottom at the Cambrian era. First place, I don't buy the Cambrian era and all that stuff to begin with. I think the whole Earth was created 6,000 years ago, and the flood caused nearly all of the layers that we see in the strata during that one big year-long flood. And the fossils are sorted a little bit based on other factors besides evolution. The textbooks, like the Glencoe biology, which I have out in my car, said that the clams are found at the bottom of the geologic column because clams evolved first. And birds are found at the top because birds evolved last. And they show this, division of the fossils based on, the birds. And first you got the lower life forms, the simple life forms, and then fish, amphibian, reptiles, mammals, and birds. Well, there's several ways to look at that. It might be the reason clams are found at the bottom of the geologic column is because clams are the first ones to drown in a flood. They're already at the bottom. That's where they live. Of course, they're the first ones buried. And birds are found at the top because birds are the last ones to drown in a flood. The animals might be sorted in the so-called geologic column based upon their habitat or based upon their intelligence. Clams are not very bright, They couldn't avoid disaster as quickly as other animals could. They might be sorted based on their body density. Clams' shells are a little heavier than bird feathers, and so they're going to be sorted in a flood situation. The shifting and sorting of the mud just by the rising tides. If the flood lasted for a year, like the Bible says, the rising and lowering of the tides would shuffle the sediments and the dead animals down there and sort them pretty neatly based on their body structure, based on their intelligence, based on their density. It has nothing to do with evolution. So I resent, I guess, what's happening in our school system where the kids are no longer being educated, in my opinion. They're being indoctrinated. They're only being shown one side. They're being taught the humanist view. All the textbooks, just like it is a fact that you don't dare question, they will say 20 billion years ago there was a Big Bang. That is not a fact. That is a philosophy. That's one philosophy of how the world got here. But it's certainly not a scientific fact. Certainly not observable, not demonstrable. You can't do it again. The evidence used to support this is the idea that the stars are moving away from us. The red shift is about the only evidence that the stars are moving away, and nobody knows for sure what's causing the red shift. But if it is indeed the Doppler effect of light and the stars are moving away, and then they calculate how fast they're moving and measure how far they've gone and figure, wow, this would have taken 20 billion years. Well, that all sounds good, but this is based on some real fundamental assumptions. You're assuming it all started at one point. Maybe God made the whole universe 6,000 years ago, and then people disobeyed God, and God put into effect the second law of thermodynamics, and everything began drifting off. Everything's falling apart. And it's only moved for 6,000 years. If you go down here on Interstate 10, which goes from Los Angeles all the way to Jacksonville, if you stand there on the side of Interstate 10 and see somebody headed toward Jacksonville, Florida, at 60 miles an hour, that does not prove they started in Los Angeles 5 days ago. They might have just got on at the last exit. So we are observing a little bit of movement of the stars, we think. Okay, I'll go along with that. But that doesn't prove it's been going for billions of years. And I'm I guess, very worried for our school system because the kids are being, I think, brainwashed into believing one theory. They're not even shown the other options. Basically, either there is a creator or there isn't. They're not even shown the creation option in our textbooks, at least. Now, here at the university, I thank Dr. Pruitt for inviting me out. He's been very gracious, had me out several times. Several teachers have asked me to come out and speak. I think it's very fair that students see both sides. You don't have to believe it. You can be wrong if you'd like. But you have a right to believe whatever you want. But there are other ways to look at this. And our school system, I think, in most instances, is not educating. It's indoctrinating the students. This is what you're supposed to believe, and the kids have to be tested on that. And I resent that. So that's basically the creation view as I see it, and the evolution view as I read it in the textbooks, and I've read hundreds of them. There may be some variations of this, but this is, in a nutshell, the humanist view of history. And if you'll take any questions you've got on that, Dr. Pruitt will give present his side of this, and then we'll take any questions that you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Then they tell the kids the Earth formed from a hot molten mass 4.6 billion years ago. This is part of the theory, and it's in all the textbooks. 4.6 billion years ago, Earth cooled down, formed a rocky crust. I think that is stupid, and I'll show you why. Was the Earth ever really a hot molten mass 4.6 billion years ago, and it cooled down? This textbook says, as Earth formed, the surface was like the moon. There were hot pools of bubbling lava. I don't think so. My Bible says the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So the Earth was not created a hot molten mass. It was created under water, which means it has to be less than 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees centigrade, or it wouldn't be water, it'd be steam. So the Earth was never a hot molten mass according to Scripture. Then when you look in the granite rocks, you find little tiny halos made of polonium. Now these polonium halos are absolutely amazing. Robert Gentry, a friend of mine from Knoxville, Tennessee area, he has been studying radiopolonium halos for a long time. I met him back in the year 2000 and went down to his laboratory, and I got to see some of the halos through the microscope. These little polonium halos are interesting because they have a half-life of less than a few minutes. If the rock was hot, when the polonium, radioactive polonium, decayed and sent out the little particles and made the halo, it would melt away. Like at 4th of July, they shoot fireworks up. Makes a circle. Does the circle stay there? No, it all falls down, right? There are probably none up there now from the last 4th of July, are there? You'd have to freeze the whole atmosphere to keep that sphere in place. This polonium would have to be decaying in a rock that is already solid. So the Earth was never a hot molten mass. Get Robert Gentry's book if you want a lot more on that. But all over, the granites all over the world contain these polonium halos. So it is stupid to say the Earth was a hot molten mass. We have scientific evidence it was not. Here they tell the kids, though, the Earth was hot with large pools of bubbling lava, and that is just stupid. It can't possibly be true. Then they tell them life got started about 3 billion years ago. See, according to the theory, 20 billion years ago there was a big bang. 4.6 billion years ago the Earth cooled down, formed a hard rocky crust, and it rained on the rocks for millions of years and turned them into soup. And the soup came alive about 3 billion years ago. This is what the books teach. This fellow says, both the origin of life and the origin of major groups of animals remains unknown. How did life get started anyway? Well, this textbook tells the kids, oceans formed as it rained on the rocks for millions of years. Yes, boys and girls, millions of years of torrential rains created great oceans. And swirling in the waters of the oceans is a bubbling broth of complex chemicals. Progress from a complex chemical soup to a living organism is very slow. Well, I guess it is. It's totally stopped. Doesn't even happen. That's how slow it is. This one says the first self-replicating systems must have emerged in this organic soup. Was your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa soup? I think that's stupid, okay? Now, if they want to believe it, that's fine. I don't care what they believe, but don't call it science. What happened back in the 1950s, a guy named Miller and Urey wanted to know how the Earth and solar system had come to be. So they tell the kids he took a mixture of Earth's primitive atmosphere. We'll talk about that in a minute. He never proved how life originated, but he did add evidence to the theory that life could have started by itself. Oh, is that true? Now, did he really do that? Well, let's just study the facts here. This textbook tells the kids many important events occurred during the Archean era, the most important of which was the evolution of life. Progress from complex molecules to even simplest living organism was a very long process. Long ago and far away. Fairy tale kids coming up. First living cells emerged 4 billion to 3.8 billion years ago. I like that word, emerged. They use it all the time. Like, just Like that explains how it happened, you know, it just emerged. There is no record of the event, they tell the kids. Look, kid, we know what happened and you're going to be tested on this, but there's no proof. Oh, okay. It's not science. First living self-replicating systems must have emerged in this soup. I don't think so. Here's what students are taught in school. This picture of the different glass tubes and flasks and pipes going around, they tell them this is how they made life in the laboratory. He said he studied the chemical reactions of gases that existed in Earth's primitive atmosphere. Ooh, now this is important, okay? Notice up in the upper right-hand corner, he had methane, ammonia, water vapor, and hydrogen. No oxygen. He circulated these gases through these tubes through a spark, supposed to represent lightning. And sure enough, it produced a red goo at the bottom of the flask and had some amino acids in it. They didn't come close to getting life, though. Miller excluded oxygen in a reducing atmosphere because life could not evolve with oxygen. Anything that got together would oxidize. Cut a banana open, lay it on the table, it'll turn brown, it'll oxidize. Okay, so will an apple, so will anything alive. It'll oxidize. So that's why he didn't have any oxygen in the experiment. One of his gases was ammonia. Well, this creates a real serious problem because ammonia is destroyed by UV light. And UV light must be blocked by ozone, which is made from oxygen. I got a problem here. This textbook says several billion years ago, Earth's atmosphere had no free oxygen. Well, that's just simply not true. Ozone is made from oxygen and it blocks UV light, and ammonia, one of the gases needed for the experiment, is destroyed by UV light. So life cannot evolve without oxygen. But also life cannot evolve with oxygen. Well, I got a solution for that one. It didn't evolve. And by the way, the Earth has always had oxygen, even more than it does today. Okay? Air bubbles are often found trapped in amber, like the movie Jurassic Park, you know, where they drilled in and got the mosquito blood. These air bubbles, though, have 50% more oxygen than we do right now. We cover more on that on my video series, videotape number 2, about what the pre-flood world was like and why they lived to be 900 on the blue series of tapes out there on the table. But this textbook says the mixture at the bottom of the flask was rich in amino acids. Oh, come on. That is stupid. It was not rich in amino acids. Let's tell the kids what they really found, okay? He filtered out the product. As this gas went through the tubes, he sparked it, produced this goo at the bottom, and he drew the goo off because if it went through again, it would be destroyed by the spark. Now, in real life, you're not going to get a section of the ocean protected. They say this just happened by chance in the ocean. You can't filter out the product then. Secondly, what he made was 85% tar, 13% carboxylic acid, 2% amino acids. So 98% of his mixture was poisonous to life. I would not call that a success. And there are 20 different amino acids, sort of like 26 letters in the alphabet. There are 20 amino acids. Those amino acids go together to make proteins, like letters go together to make sentences. Mostly he made just 2 of these amino acids. And they bond with the tar and the acid very quickly, more readily than with each other. It was a failure as an experiment. Amino acids are like letters of the alphabet, sort of like building blocks. You have to have a bunch of amino acids to make a protein. Then you have to have a bunch of proteins to make a cell. And you got to have a bunch of cells to make an organism. And one cell is more complex than a space shuttle. And all he got was a couple of the amino acids. That's like me dropping toothpicks, and I happen to make a few letters of the alphabet. That's possible, isn't it? Toothpicks could fall in the shape of a T, or an H, or an I, or an E. That's possible. But if I'm able to drop toothpicks and produce a few letters of the alphabet, should I therefore conclude that nobody wrote Webster's dictionary? The difference between making a letter with toothpicks and making Webster's dictionary is about like making an amino acid and making a living cell. He didn't come close to making life. He made the equivalent of a few letters, and he actually needed to make huge books. And half of his letters were backwards, left-handed. This creates a real problem since the simplest proteins, the smallest proteins, have 70 to 100 amino acids, all of them left-handed. This really compounds his problem. RNA and DNA are all right-handed molecules. And they are unbelievably complex. And hundreds of these amino acids must combine to make a protein. And this has to be in a precise order. And they unbond in water much faster than they bond. And last time I checked, the oceans are completely full of water. So Brownian motion is going to drive them away from each other, not together. It just isn't going to work. He did not make life in the laboratory. But they tell the kids, He showed how life could have started by itself. Oh, that is just a stupid, okay? That's a lie. He did not show anything of the kind. And every experiment since then has made the problem worse. They're finding more and more things that just couldn't happen. Don't call that science. But they tell the kids, 3 billion years ago, life appeared on Earth. There's a great book dealing with some of the flaws in the Miller experiment. If you want more on that for your kids to study out there on the table, get the book Icons of Evolution. Then they tell the kids that these plants and animals, not only did life evolve from non-living material, then this life had to learn to reproduce itself. Why would any organism want to reproduce more of its own kind when that's only going to increase competition for the food supply? Why didn't they instead evolve the ability to live forever and be happy? Huh? You ever think about that? I was in a debate one time, and we had question and answer time at the end. The student stood up and he said to the evolutionist, he said, "Sir, how did male and female evolve?" The professor got up and he said, "Well, that is a giant mother may I step in the evolution story." A mother may I step? This is science? Wow. Well. So according to them, for the next few billion years or hundreds of millions of years, life learned to produce something other than its own kind. Of course, today everything only produces its own kind, but they say long ago and far away, they were able to do something different. Textbooks will say we started like a bacteria and slowly evolved to a human. I think that's stupid. But if you want to believe that, that's perfectly fine. Those trees of life that they put in the textbooks for your kids are a bunch of nonsense. And even evolutionists will admit that. Stephen Jay Gould, the Marxist professor at Harvard University, he says that evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks are not the evidence of fossils. It's only inference. We infer, we imply, we hope it happened this way. This textbook says, all the many forms of life on Earth today are descended from a common ancestor. What? You mean the birds and the bananas have a common ancestor? Isn't that what he says? Found in a population of primitive unicellular organisms. Well, in the first place, there's no such thing as a primitive unicellular organism, okay? One single cell is more complex than a space shuttle. There's no such thing as a primitive single-celled organism. We talk about that on video number 4 of our series. But he says, all the forms of life are descended from a common ancestor found in a population of primitive unicellular organisms. What were those first cells like? How do we know? What events led up to their formation? No traces of those events remain. Did you catch that? Hey kid, we know what happened, but there's no proof. But I'll tell you what, folks, you can crossbreed your corn from now till the cows come home, and you always get corn. You will never get a hamster or a tomato or a whale to grow on that corn stalk, okay? It won't happen. There's a variety of cows, and they probably had a common ancestor. It was a cow. Variety of horses, no question. Probably the zebra and the horse had a common ancestor. But the kids are going to be taught in school tomorrow in your town that the horse used to have 4 toes. Well, there's some things they don't tell the kids about this Eohippus to Equus series, which has been proven wrong 50 years ago, but still is in your textbooks right here in this town. They don't tell them the original so-called horse is the size of a fox. It was a meat eater and had 18 pairs of ribs. The next one had 15 pairs of ribs. A couple of trips through the buzzsaw did that. And then it miraculously grew back 19 pairs of ribs as it evolved, and then back to 18. They also don't tell them the whole thing's been proven wrong a long time ago. Like this guy says in the biology textbook, other examples like the gradual evolution of the horse have not held up under close examination. That's a polite way of saying it's proven wrong, okay? This G.G. Simpson back in 1950 said the example of the horse family has been unintentionally falsified. They knew 50 years ago this was false. Why did they keep that in your textbooks? This whole thing was made up by Othniel C. Marsh in 1874. He picked animals from all over the world and put them in order the way he thought it might have happened. They were never found in that order. Modern horses are found in the same layers as the so-called ancient Equus or Eohippus horse. They're found in the same layer. So it can't be the ancestor, that's for sure. The ancient horse is nothing but a Hyracotherium, which is still alive today. By the way, the ribs, the toes, the teeth are very different in these animals. In South America, the fossils go exactly backwards. Instead of 3-toed to 1-toed, it goes 1-toed to 3-toed in the fossil order. They won't talk about that much, but you check it out. That's a fact, folks. They're never found in the order presented in the textbooks. 3-toed and 1-toed gray side by side. Plenty of information on the internet about that. Tulsa Zoo finally took out their display because so many folks complain, why do you have this horse evolution display in the zoo? It's been proven wrong 50 years ago. Take it out. And you folks ought to get together with your school board and say, look, on page whatever it is, 952 of our textbook, it says the horse evolved from a four-toed ancestor. Let's cut this page out. If you had a page in your textbook teaching the kids the earth was flat, would it be okay to demand that that page be removed? You don't have to buy a whole new book. Just cut the page out. It won't cost the school anything. How many of you would volunteer to help cut the pages out and bring your own scissors? See? Won't cost them a dime. And you send me your book and I'll show you which pages need to be taken out. I've read hundreds of them. I can find them like that. Free of charge. I'll donate my time. Folks, there's quite a variety of horses today. Okay, there's big horses and little horses. I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana a few months ago. Got to see where they raised the 30-inch tall horses. I mean, my dog's bigger than that. What do you do with a 30-inch horse? Look at it, I guess is about it. And they sell them for $10,000. Sucker born every minute, I guess. But one lady wrote me a letter and said, Mr. Hovind, we crossbreed zebras, ponies, horses, and mules. Not mules, the jackass. And we raise zonkies, zorses, zeonies. They cross every which way. Well, that's probably because they're the original same kind. No problem there. If you want to see all the fatal flaws in the horse evolution story, get the book out there, Icons of Evolution.